let's move on to the 25th President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, or Teddy Roosevelt. The five criteria we always look at are the same: growth, finances, international politics, war and security, and did they leave the country better or worse than they found it? Roosevelt came in with a lot of people thinking he was going to continue on a lot of McKinley's imperialist ideas as far as not just making America a world power or a very important great nation, but I think McKinley was even pushing toward really getting into the competition with the European powers, really entangling us in a lot of places, really getting into expansionism in a very dangerous way. He was also a president who I believe was more working for the good of the businesses than the country itself. Um, and I think if we're going to look at growth, there are many different ways to look at growth. We've discussed in the past with regards to Jefferson and Polk, physical land expansion and the value of that land. We've talked with other presidents with regards to population growth, with regards to protecting certain segments of the population so that the economy could expand. In terms of Roosevelt, Roosevelt really completely changed American conception of itself. He was very much a person who was incredibly America positive. He had a lot of conversations about things like hyphenated Americans and saying, whatever country you came from, you're now American here. And I think part of his view was that America was a specific thing in his mind and that other countries were specific things in their mind. And he was not, in the way that McKinley was, as interested in expansion of the physical American state as he was building great relationships and making America a very powerful, important country in a very well balanced world, which is a very different concept than I think anyone else had had before him. I don't want to overstate Teddy Roosevelt. I don't want to make him sound like some sort of superhuman. He had many, many flaws, and we'll touch on them as we get to various things. In fact, I think even with regards to growth, we can have a lot of discussions of his flaws. But what I think Roosevelt did is had the Gilded Age going on where business was doing quite well. Industrialization was happening all over the world. And everywhere that industrialization was happening, you had the major industrial centers, and then you had the raw materials being brought from colonies in different places all over the world. And that wasn't going to last forever. Eventually, your dependence on countries that were viewing themselves as separate from you was going to lead to a conflict and a problem, and that is kind of what happened with regards to World War I eventually. Roosevelt's conception was more of I want allies, I want friends, I want people we can work with, I want to speak softly and carry a big stick, as he would say, in terms of we are going to be the most powerful nation in the world, and we're going to ask for things, and if we can be friends, you will give us the things, and if you can't, we will take them. The best example of this probably is Panama, where Panama was a part of Colombia. And then there were some difficulties in the negotiations, and suddenly we were going to support Panama for independence. I say all this to say I'm not overly praising Roosevelt in the current mindset. In the current mindset, a lot of what he did would 100% be imperialist and looked on negatively. I think we need to look in the framework of his time, though, in that these types of actions would have been different. We simply would have, other European countries would simply have sent in huge armies and occupied the area and not had any discussion about local rule or local rights. We would have annexed Cuba immediately and made it similar to what we did in Puerto Rico. But there was discussion and determination about the rights of self-rule in various places. Even in the Philippines, where Roosevelt continued the war and put down a lot of the Philippine resistance movements, it was still understood that eventually the Philippines would be their own independent country. So I don't want to overstate what he did. There are lots of ways to criticize it, but I think in the context of the time, it was remarkable that he was at least viewing these places as having rights and independence. He was often brought in to negotiate treaties between other countries. I believe he won a Nobel Peace Prize for negotiations between Japan and Russia. He was involved in negotiations with France and England and Germany around Morocco. He was considered someone who other parties would think would be fair. He was not considered someone who was going to arbitrarily force his interests in the way that his predecessors had. He was not as directly selfish and self-serving. He certainly was pro-America and he would support America and he did things for America, but he didn't view America's role as dominating and conquering the rest of the world in the way that Europeans kind of did with their colonial ambitions. And that shift, I think, was a huge positive shift for America and, arguably for the world. But I'm only focused on America and the American presidency. I think his disentangling from the things that would eventually lead to Europe collapsing into World War I could have gone a completely different direction, and we're on a trajectory to go that direction. And his focus on America and focus on taking care of our own, which I'll get to later. Well, actually, I'll get to here. He created the first inclinations of a social safety net with his square deal. He began putting protections in place for things like food. Was it because of Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle? Probably. That was certainly, I think it was Upton Sinclair. That was certainly a part of it. But he was interested in helping people. He wasn't interested in just hiding things or sweeping things under the rug. He was interested in reforms. He was interested in making sure that businesses also served the people. He was not a socialist by any means. I'm not going to stretch it to that point. But again, he was interested in fairness. He correctly identified the bankers' crisis as being something that was the fault of the rich, and adjusted accordingly. Which moves us on to finances. So in terms of growth, I'm going to give him fairly high marks. Not incredibly high marks, not like top of all time, but I think he did a lot to grow America, make America more powerful as a nation generally, and to help the people of America. So I think he gets positive marks there. In terms of finances, I think he also gets positive marks. I think the economy did well under him, and I think his implementation of the antitrust laws that had been on the books for a long time but largely ignored was done in such a way that it didn't impede growth economically. Again, I think he was viewed as a fair broker, and I think he acted in that way as a fair broker. When he had interventions, he leaned toward neither side, but more toward whatever the most positive overall outcome was. He was not always right, but I think that was something that was different than what had come before, where Cleveland and McKinley both were very much sending out, very much in favor of the business class. Cleveland actively sending out federal troops to break strikes, those types of things. McKinley looking the other way through all sorts of corruption. Roosevelt went back to the idea of reform and also had the type of personality where it was popular and he was able to get it through and he was able to get it done and he was able to negotiate with both sides in a way that others who came before him couldn't. He was the youngest president ever elected. He was I'm sorry, he wasn't elected. He came to office. He wasn't initially elected, I should say. He came to office after the death of McKinley. But he did a remarkable job of negotiating everything around him, which is a lot of what a politician is supposed to do, particularly in the presidency. And so I give him relatively high marks. I'm not going to give him exceptionally high marks. I would say, above average, because there was a financial panic under his watch, but I would say not one that was excessive. And when you consider the fact that he did things like having major tax reforms planned, having an 8-hour workday added for, I think the federal government specifically, many banking, pushing the banking reforms after 1907, and putting so many new laws in place that had not existed. Again, far less oversight than we would consider acceptable today, but we're going from the Gilded Age to this step forward, and there was no prior inclination by the other political parties on either side to go this direction. There were certainly calls by third parties, populist movements of like let's watch out for the workers, such and such, but they weren't winning elections, and that was an impressive feat. In terms of international politics, again, we were trending toward an imperialist agenda where we were trying to do the same things that would eventually that were kind of failing the great powers to outsource our natural resources. And we were blessed that we didn't need to because we have such a huge country that has so many abundant natural resources as opposed to the classic Western powers in Europe, France, England, Germany. They're not physically as large. They were dependent on getting natural resources from other places and through conquest, and they were never willing to allow those other places to become part of their country. I think one of the underappreciated aspects of American history is as we acquired states, the states then became part of our country. Whereas in European conquest, you would conquer an area, but it would never really become part of your country. And so it would be simply a few generations before the people there, because they were never part of your culture, simply revolted and wanted to have their own country. And as the concept of nationalism came into play, the various groups remained separated. But he didn't push beyond America like McKinley did. He came in with the Philippines occupied, with Cuba occupied, with Puerto Rico occupied, with Guam occupied, and he left basically in the same type of situation, but with a clear path for the Philippines and Cuba to eventually, in theory, become their own independent nations. There were many, many hiccups along the way. Again, don't want to give him too much credit, but for the time, that was not the norm. The norm was you were going to be under the yoke of the European occupying force for as long as we can. And the idea of allowing independence was more something that was going to happen against will rather than as part of the plan. And I think a lot of the mythology of the altruism of the invasions that is ascribed to McKinley really come from what happened when Roosevelt took power and his actions toward that. I don't think McKinley was actually inclined in that direction. I think that was just the myth that was fed to justify and rationalize the war in the same way that many Europeans would claim they were, civilizing the savages. But I think Roosevelt coming in understood that these countries were separate from America and that we should build a relationship with them, not just conquer them. Because if you just conquer people, eventually you're begging for them to overthrow you. And again, also in international politics, he was amazing at his ability to get other countries to look to America as a broker. He really started that process of being a broker. There are some arguments that happened before with McKinley and some other presidents. Again, I could see someone coming back and criticizing me of being too negative with regards to McKinley and giving Roosevelt too much credit. But I really think McKinley's actions versus his words demonstrate what his intents were. Whereas I think Roosevelt, after the negotiations, after his actions, people would say he was an honest broker. Again, he got the Nobel Peace Prize for his negotiations with Japan and Russia, and people asked him to do it again and again because he was viewed as someone who was not there just to do what was in America's specific best interest or to pick a side and an ally. He was trying to build relationships in a large scale. In terms of war security, again, I go with that. I wish he had unwound the war in the Philippines more quickly. I wish that the Cuban situation had unfolded better. But I also look at how it was and how doing comparisons to other countries who had similar colonial occupations and how those things worked out, I'm giving him credit on a relative scale because it could have gone so much worse. And that was something that was handed to him. You could make the argument that he argued in favor of the Philippine occupation when he was vice president, but I'm only looking at his presidency and what he did during his time. And in that term, I think he did well. He also understood the importance of expanding the United States military, of growing the military in strength. That was the big stick that came as part of, speak softly, but carry the big stick. And I think he should get credit. Again, not an exceptional rating, but he should get credit. Where I do think I'm going to give him very high marks is in terms of better or worse. Because Roosevelt comes in at the height of the corrupt Gilded Age. At the moment, America is dipping its toe deeply into imperialism following the Spanish-American War. At a point, we were about to go down a very dark path of, occupation of other nations for exploitive reasons, while also exploiting workers at home, giving no protections. income inequality to the nth degree, eventually leading to discontent and political unrest. His predecessor was assassinated, after all. And he left a country with worker protections that had not existed prior, with an understanding that the people of America, the workers and the citizens, were also people that needed to be taken care of, with food safety and basic oversight and needs, that business needed to be managed and trusts needed to be broke. Monopolies were negative, and those powers had previously had so much hold over the country that they could so influence politics that we had to send federal troops to protect the railroads from striking, rather than ask the railroads, why don't you just pay the workers more? I think that the country he left was fundamentally better than the country he received because of the changes he made, and he did them in such a way that they were popular, so that he could be reelected and continue those. He is the only president I can think of off the top of my head who both conservatives and progressives point to and go, other than the big ones. Let me go back. Obviously, Jefferson, Washington are at the top, but most conservatives and most progressives who seriously look at Roosevelt can both agree that he did things that they're in favor of. The conservatives like the America focus and like the American exceptionalism arguments and the big stick. And progressives like the fact that he actually reformed governments. He broke up large businesses. He instituted reforms that had not really been considered seriously before. So because of all that, where do I put him? Well, as I just said, there's the big two, Washington and Lincoln. He's not going to pass Washington and Lincoln. But before I did this, I started going through all the presidents we've had before and really looking at my list again, because I don't think I'm going to make any major adjustments up or down. But as I was reconsidering in the past, there were some times where I was like, I gave them a lot of credit for the time, but now we have a larger pool and we need to look at it while still respecting the context of their time, asking a bigger question of where they fall. And I do think that I'm going to put Theodore Roosevelt above Thomas Jefferson at number 3. My reasoning is this. I think Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase acquisition was a huge positive for the United States, one of the greatest decisions in the history, in American history. But I also think I undersold Jefferson's failure with regards to leaving his successor the War of 1812 on his lap coming. And so in that reconsideration, I slightly lowered my opinion of Jefferson, and I compared it to what Roosevelt left behind. And I think the most important thing we're looking at is whether he left the country better or worse. And while I'll still say Jefferson absolutely left the country better or worse, he left a mess that needed to be cleaned up, and I don't think Roosevelt did. So again, the rankings, he's going to be number 3rd, just ahead of Thomas Jefferson.